don't know about you, but sometimes I feel like my entire world is an explosion of pieces of yarn, but I hate throwing any yarn away. And it's not just an environmental thing, it just feels really wasteful, especially since some yarn is really expensive. So today what I'm going to do is share with you my favorite ways to use yarn scraps, some really nice little ideas for how you can involve yarn scraps in your existing projects, and I want to show you some really off-the-wall ideas for yarn scraps that I have found online recently, and they're interesting. So because yarn scraps is such a generalized term, I'm going to break this down into 3 sections. The first one that we're going to look at is partial skeins. So that's when you've used a bit off the ball of wool, but not all of it. The next one is going to be scraps. So that's bits that are at least a couple of feet long that there are some practical uses for, but not nearly in the same scale as the partial skein. Then we're going to look at teeny tiny bits and what I use for them. And finally, we're going to look at those interesting ideas I certainly wouldn't have thought of. That'll be fun. But first, before we dive into those awesome ideas for yarn scraps, I just want to very quickly tell you about today's sponsor, the Crochet subscription box service, Hooks and Needles. I am so happy to be sharing this one with you today. So I've reviewed one of their subscription boxes in the past. There's a really big review that you can check out there where I dive into all of the details of the box. And today they have sent me box number 2, the second month in the subscription service. And I have got to tell you, if anything, I'm even happier with the second box than the first one. It's got this beautiful purple yarn inside it, a lovely hook, the right size to use with it. It's just my sort of hook too. It's also come with, as you can see, some accessories for making a bag. So we've got a cute little tassel and a really nice quality looking strap there as well. Within the subscription box you get a little book, and within the booklet there are 3 patterns. Now the supplies that you're given in the box enable you to make any one of those 3 patterns, and they're designed to be beginner friendly, intermediate or advanced, so you can pick whichever one works for you. For me, I am very excited to have a bag strap, so I think I'm going to use it to make a bag. It's also come with this selection of really lovely stitch markers. Now I don't normally buy myself fancy stitch markers, so it's a really nice gift to have some. So if this seems like something that you're going to enjoy, you can get 20% off when you've placed your first order using the code Lucy20. So just put in the coupon code box at checkout, Lucy20. That'll get you 20% off your first box. And thank you so much again to Hooks and Needles for sponsoring today's video. One of my favourite ways to use up yarn scraps is through granny squares. You can do this in a couple of different ways. My 2 favourites are to either do for each round a different colour, so colour change, and very consciously don't pattern match or try to make it in a particular order. Line up your scrap and then go, okay, as a general colour palette, does this look good? Right, and then try to throw all rules of colours and orders out of the window and just randomly pick one for each of your rounds as you go around. Another great way to do it, which I really love too, is by simply colour changing at the end of each partial. So just joining to a completely contrasting or different colour as you come to the end of each partial skein. You can end up then with a big blanket that kind of gently merges from one colour into the next as you go. And then of course you've got granny squares that have sort of natural divides that makes it really easy to use them for different colours. I love the Modern Heart granny square for this. Again, if you try to get yourself out of doing an ordered colour and just put whatever colour comes into your head into it, can be such a great way of doing it. Again, this star is a fabulous way to do this. If you've got a big pile of bits of skeins from different projects like I do, then this is a great one to focus in on, as is the sun granny square. This is my favourite way of making a sun granny square, but there are loads of different ways of making them. One of my favourite things to do with partial skeins is to make keychains, and I've designed quite a few of these over the years, and I'm really excited to share a few of them with you today. Now I must admit, not all of these I've put the patterns up online for yet. Most of them are, and if I do have the patterns up, there'll be links down below. If you see one that you want the pattern for, they're all in my notepad. It's just that they're not up yet. So if you say you want one, when you see it in the comments section below, I will get that up for you within the next week or so. But for now, let's take a look. So first off, we've got this little cat. This was one of the first keychains that I actually ever made, and it was because I had this really cute sort of mottled yarn, like a tiny part of a skein left over for it. And I thought, hang on, looks a bit like my mum's cat. So I have made, this is Billy, I have made him in crochet form, and as you can see, he's absolutely tiny. He's not taken up much of the yarn at all. DK weight yarn is best for these little tiny ones that I'm about to show you, by the way. But yeah, it uses up, I would guess, 10 to 20 grams of yarn, and it's very much based around this little ball shape with the features to make it look like a cat, and then you can use other scraps to make his little nose and whiskers. Then we've got the lion. This actually might be my favorite of the keychains. I had an awful lot of fun making the mane. It's a tiny bit fiddly, but it's not too bad. So honestly, it's just repeating chains that are then slip stitched back into where the last one finished, just rotating all the way around the head there. And because it's such an iconic animal, it's nice and clear what it's meant to be, I think. Next up in the parade of keychains, we've got this cute little mouse. I had a lot of fun making some rather exaggerated ears for this one, but again, super straightforward, tiny bits of different scraps. So if you've got some grey and some pink left over, this is a good one. But, you know, mice come in a lot of colours. You can have a white mouse, a black mouse, a patchy mouse. Patchy as in patches, not as in Apache, a helicopter, because that would be weird. Now you can see I had quite a bit of grey. This one is my seal. Now I made the little cheeks of the seal by separate pieces. These are then hand sewn together, so it's just like a round or two from a magic circle. I made the same for his nose part, but I just didn't join the magic circle. So as you get to the end of the magic circle, you then work back into it rather than joining it up. And I had quite a bit of fun with the tail on this one to make it look like a proper big flippery tail. Next up we have the pig. Pigs, again, these little ball toys that you're going to make out of your yarn scraps for a keychain. The key is just to think, the salient point is just to think about how you define that animal. If you describe the animal to a toddler, how would you describe it? Well, with a pig, it's got that round nose, flopped over ears, and a curly tail. So literally, if you want to make your own, you just make a ball and then you add those features that are the most recognizable to the breed onto them. And then obviously using an appropriate color helps a lot with that as well. So I hope it's clear that this is a rabbit. I did a little lopped over ear thing with this guy. I also made this with a bit of a rougher selection of yarn scraps, and yeah, it's cute. Don't know if it's as cute as the others, but it's a fun idea. So if you have a rabbit and you want to use your scraps to make your rabbit, then it's just a ball, little tiny nose on the end, and then just make as long ears as you feel appropriate. And that just gives it a bit of character, doesn't it? This yarn scraps toy was designed by my friend Sarah, and it's so cute. So the idea is that it has lots of different parts to it, and you just use up all your scraps on those different parts. So it's got that cute little pocket at the back, some little shapes on the front. It's a really adorable look, and because it's built in so many different pieces, it enabled her to just use up all of her yarn scraps on one toy, and it is a really big hit with her daughter as well. So that's a lovely one too if you want to make just like a cute squishy kind of toy. If you've got a slightly bigger partial skein, so you know you had 100-gram skein, you've got half of it left, that kind of thing, then there are some lovely smaller toys that you can make from that as well. So I've grabbed a couple of my smaller patterns for you as examples. Basically, as a good rule of thumb, I find if I've got an incomplete skein but that is at least half, something that is palm sized is generally quite a good bet for a partial skein. Now this little crocodile also has some great ways of using up those scraps in terms of those finer details, and if you want to make a toy like this and you have several scraps from different greens, for example, then you can build that and merge them through the pattern as well, and then use up several different types too. In a very similar vein, this is my dragon, which the pattern that I designed based on the crocodile, so it was built from it because I showed a friend of mine the crocodile and she was like, that would make a good dragon, so I made her a dragon. The nice thing about the dragon is it's a fantasy animal as well, so you can use up lots of different coloured scraps for that one too. A very similar toy that I have as well is my giant Madagascan day gecko here. Nice and small sized for using up that partial skein, and it's also got some lovely markings that you can then make from scraps as well. Another one that would work really well is my little goat here, and again, goats come in so many colours. It's a great way to use up those little scraps. Also, the fine details, doing them in different colours like the ears and the horns also helps just to use up those different bits and pieces. Now moving on to smaller pieces, and in some ways this is my favourite category of yarn scraps, right, because there is no end to what you can do with them. I love using up my yarn scraps as details on my toys. So there's a couple of examples next to me here. One of them is my crochet pine marten. Now, to add character to a toy is sometimes a challenge, and yet it's the simplest things that can make a big difference. And for this guy, it was these little eyebrows. The eyebrows really lift up the face and make it look a lot more like it has an expression. And the same thing was true with the yarn scraps that I used on my squid. Now I used these scraps again for facial details here, and these facial details brought out the eyes. So it looked cute before they were on there, but this just really lifted it up, and especially because I used this plush yarn and the rest of it is with an acrylic based one, it really lifted it up. Cotton? It's a cotton blend. But yeah, so the plush really lifted up because it had that different texture to it. So don't be afraid to experiment with different yarn fibres to the bulk of the project when you're adding on these fine facial details. Other details that I use littler but not tiny yarn scraps for are surface crocheting, and you can see that on this squid as well. So I literally lifted and defined these points of the crest on the squid by surface crocheting around the edges, and there are so many features that you can do this on toys that add like a much bigger extra dimension than it should in terms of effort. So it takes it from being slightly plain to looking so much more defined in quite a short period of time. So it's really good use for them. And then we've got hand sewn details onto completed or nearly completed projects as well. Like we saw this example with the gecko here earlier as well. So literally this is just sewn lines. Now the reason that I did this in quite a defined over the top way is that is what her pattern looked like. So she had very clear striped lines across her back, and the only way to really make them look true to her pattern, because they weren't raised up, you know, it's a part of her scales on her back, was to hand sew them on. And it is again a great way to use your scraps, as is doing eyelashes for things as well, as you can see on this doll here too. The other thing that scraps are great for is fine details, and if you have like a length but not a vast amount for adding these little fine details, it can make a really big difference to a project. So I'm currently working on a new toy pattern. Can you tell what it is yet? I'm not going to tell you. I'd love to know if you know just from this. A part of how I'm bringing out, and it's not an exact replica of this animal's particular pattern, but it is a nod in the direction that when all the bits are together, trust me, makes it look more like it. And this is scraps. This is not even nearly full skeins of yarn that I used for these little white sections here. The brown was a partial skein, the white was just some lengthy scraps. And as you can see, it really highlights and brings out the details of this. So it's really useful to add it in. I also like to do it to cuffs on some of my toys and to ankles, and it just gives this definition between the foot part and the rest that really adds something to it. And you can just use these tiny bits. You don't need to go out and buy a whole new skein of yarn. I've now said skein so many times that I no longer know if that's how that word is said. You can correct me in the comments. I won't cry. I'll cry a bit, but you know. Now let's talk very briefly about teeny tiny pieces before we move on to the wacky ideas that are mostly teeny tiny pieces based. Let's face it, the best thing to do with teeny tiny scraps of yarn, the kind that are like really short lengths that you can't do anything else with, is stuffing. The best thing I find is making a layer on the outside of each section with traditional toy safe stuffing, and then just putting all of your scraps in between. Some people also put their tights. Some people also put their scraps within an old pair of stockings or tights to ensure that they definitely can't escape. It's not something I've ever done, but it seems like a pretty sensible idea too. But what if you've got lots of tiny scraps of stuffing and you want to do something completely different? And so let's see what we think. I'd love to know which of these you guys think that I should have a go with, because I am going to have a go with one of them. So here is the list. Option 1, poking yarn scraps through things that would not normally have yarn scraps poked through them. So you take the tiny scraps and you poke them through other objects. So for example, a wicker basket, you might poke little bits of yarn through it. You might poke little bits of yarn through your belt. You could poke bits through a canvas bag. Option 2, and very mixed feelings about this, yarn in resin. Now I've heard this described as yarn fossils. Big fan of fossils. Not a big fan of fake fossils, also not a big fan of words being used incorrectly. It's not a yarn fossil. People call it a yarn fossil, and I think I may have derailed myself here, but yarn in resin. So the idea is you get a few different scraps of like contrasting or bold colours and you set them in resin and it basically makes like a really cool design. To me, this sounds like the paperweights that we used to see a lot when I was a kid. And they look kind of marbly inside, but in a sort of liquidy way. But whereas this would be yarn in resin. So interesting thought. And then the final one of the totally off the wall ideas is yarn in clay. Now, predominantly people are talking about air drying clay. Now you can fire clay with bits of other fabric in it, but I'm not sure what that would do to the structural integrity of what you were making. So we'd have to ask a potter that, whereas I had a 1-day course of pottery 3 years ago. So not a pottery expert, so I reckon air drying clay is the safest way to try this one, and I really want to give this a go. I do get air drying clay occasionally. I love building clay sculptures with my kids. It's one of my favourite things to do with them. So this is the one I'm leaning towards, but which one do you think that I should have a go with? Should I do yarn in clay? Should I do yarn in resin? Or should I poke yarn into a random wicker basket? And I do have some random wicker baskets, so these are all doable things. Finally, I just want to give a very quick shout out to yarn in botany. You heard me. One of the things that I use yarn scraps for a lot is tying up my plants, to pin up things that are naturally tall but not great at self-supporting their own weight, like orchids. But I also use it to attach pothos so it grows in it's a floppy down plant, so it grows in more upwards ways. But what do you use yarn scraps for? Do you like those ideas? Of the weird yarn scrap ideas, which one shall I have a go with? I will give one of those a go. Let me know which one. Let me know which yarn scraps ideas you already do, which ones were new to you, and if I've missed anything out, please do share it in the comments section below as well. And once again, thank you so much to Hooks and Needles for sponsoring this video, and if you want to sign up for one of their beautiful subscription boxes, pop the code Lucy20 in at checkout for your 20% discount on your first box, and I will see you again soon. Happy crocheting!